Hello and what is up, my friends? Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to be talking about one of my favorite franchises of all time, the Blizzard classic, Warcraft. And tonight we're going to be... Wait a minute. Nope, not this one. Here we go. This is the Warcraft I remember. This is definitely the right game. Wait, no, that's World of Warcraft. Sorry, wrong game. Okay, this is... Wait. Hell no, this is definitely not what we're here to talk about tonight. What is this? Where did this come from? Why does this exist? Ah, that's definitely not it. There it is. That's the game I want to talk about. This is 1994's Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. In this video, I'm going to talk about my history with the game and how it stacked up both at release and if you should be giving this game your time today now that it has been remastered. I've recently decided to play through the entire Warcraft series from the beginning, and I'll putting out full playthrough videos and reviews for each title as I complete them. In the last 2 weeks, I have completed both the Orc and the Human campaigns in the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and this video I'm going to be talking about both my positive and negative thoughts after beating this original game. Now to start with, my first exposure to the Warcraft franchise was actually Warcraft II on the original PlayStation 1. I was a console gamer growing up, but I was always the Nintendo kid in my neighborhood, so I largely missed out on the real-time strategy genre until much later. I had the Nintendo 64, but I had a neighbor who had the PlayStation. I can remember going to their house and seeing Warcraft II for the first time and being really drawn to it. I never actually played the game at their house, but I watched them play, and it really, it was a new experience. I really never played an RTS game. The gameplay was so different from anything I had ever experienced. All the units had voices and personalities. The cutscenes for someone coming from a Nintendo 64 really revelatory. And it was just a really fun and cool experience. It was a couple of years later when I actually got my first computer in Christmas of '99, and I can remember the first 2 games I got were Half-Life 1 and StarCraft, which is probably the best birthday I ever had. I got a new computer, 2 of the best games of all time. And then a couple months later, I got Warcraft II Battle Edition, and I played through the entire game. And at this point in my life, basically after playing StarCraft, playing Warcraft, I got Diablo 1. I realized if Blizzard's name was on a box, it was going to be a good game. That was a time where you could just, if they released something, you knew it was going to be great. And I was devouring every game I could find with their name on it. And after beating Warcraft 2, I decided I should go and try the original Warcraft. I found a 40 megabyte demo on Blizzard's website, and it took me all day to download it on my 56K internet. And I immediately hated it. I was so disappointed. And even though Warcraft 2 came out less than a year after the original, they had improved the game so much that it was impossible for me to play that original game and really still experience fun. Now, in hindsight, I realize that this is an important game in the history of PC gaming, but just 5 years later, it felt so antiquated because of the vast leaps the genre had experienced. You could only select 4 units at a time, and to do that, you had to hold the shift button. It was slow, it was ugly, but when you look at it for its time, it was pretty revolutionary. The genre basically started with Doom 2 in 1992, and was still in its infancy. Warcraft really refined the genre by adding things like multiple resource types to manage, multiplayer, a deeper storyline with rudimentary cutscenes, and also a killer manual. Really, have you ever seen this thing? It's literally 2 manuals in one for each race. It also really pushed skillful management of these smaller armies, which feels like the precursor to the micro-heavy real-time strategy and MOBA games that came much, much later. So the question is, should you play this game today now that it has been remastered? And let's talk about what has changed here. You can now select up to 12 units at a time. You don't need to hold shift to do that. You can double-click units to select all units of the same type. There's a rudimentary attack move, though I really would not rely on it, it's kind of terrible still. The game speed has been increased, the graphics have been rebuilt and improved, though you can toggle the original. I know some people do not love the new look. It's kind of got like that mobile game kind of look to it, almost like a flash game or like one of those fake games. But I think after playing through, it's really grown on me, and I don't know that I could go back to the original graphics at this point. Now, let's also talk about what has not changed and things that I think maybe are missing, especially if you are playing modern RTS. These are quality of life features that I think they could have added to improve it even further. You cannot queue multiple units to be built, but rather you have to build them one at a time. You cannot queue up any instructions or orders, like telling a worker to build several structures in a row, or to start harvesting after they're done. You cannot set rally points for units after completion. There's no auto cast, and when you have several units selected, you cannot cycle through them to use abilities, but rather have to manually select individual units. It makes casting and using abilities a chore. Beyond the mechanical and interface elements missing, there are a lot of little things in the gameplay that can be frustrating. First, the human campaign is way easier and less frustrating than the orc, and I might suggest if you only want to play one, to start there. One of the biggest culprits is the invisibility skill from the human cleric. The AI will constantly send invisible units to you, and they always target your workers. Even if you park several units at your worker line, they almost always get one, and the AI is so bad all the other workers will flee across the map. Secondly, the mines always spawn far away from your starting point, and it's always a drag every game having to hunt down your first mine, and the terrible AI always takes the worst route. Speaking of terrible AI, you need to constantly babysit your units. If you send 12 units selected and send them across the map, half the time they're going to take 3 separate routes to get there or get lost along the way. This forces you to babysit those units and slowly move them across the map. While you're doing this, a single invisible unit will disrupt your worker line with little warning, and now your income has ceased. If you're lucky enough to get a copy of the manual, which oddly it doesn't seem comes with the remastered version, there is a ton of story in that manual setting up the game and all the characters and everything. The story within the game itself is pretty limited. There's an intro cinematic, and between missions there's about a single paragraph setting up the mission with some really, really awesome narration. The original version actually had some animation on this screen, but the remaster unfortunately was downgraded here, and it's just a static image for some reason. You'll see a few familiar names and locations, but there's really no context or explanation to anything, and much of the story has been retconned in the later games anyways. The mission variety is also very, very limited, and the objectives are always quite simple. You never come across any secondary or optional objectives. There's very few story elements during the mission, and I really miss the fun and unique objectives that the later Blizzard games added to these RTS games. They're very, very simplistic in this Warcraft Orcs and Humans, unfortunately. The unit selection's pretty limited, and for the first few missions you have very few choices. Even when they finally unlock all the units, you'll find that there's only a few usable strategies, and both races are very nearly identical, with just a few non-important stat differences and a couple of spells being unique to each race. Both sides have a melee fighter, a ranged unit, a knight unit, a catapult. The biggest difference is the cleric and necrolite and the conjurer and warlock, who have different spells that largely fill the same niches, just in different ways. I haven't played online because there isn't much of a community, but based on the campaign, I enjoyed playing as human more because of the spells that they have. Base building is also quite limited. There's only a few buildings, there's no defensive structures outside of the walls that you can build, there's no base expansion, so if you need a second mine, your workers are taking a long walk with terrible AI. You need to build along roads, which are very costly to construct, and limit base design, and the need to build tight bases just exacerbates the problem with unit pathing and harvesting from your gold mines. Nearly every building or unit feels just slightly too expensive, and getting your economy started is just painful. With the distance to your mine being really far, workers cost 400 gold apiece. Some unit upgrades can cost all the way up to 3,000 gold, and your workers only bring back 100 at a time. That's when they're not hindered by the long distance to your mine and the bad AI and the invisible harassers on the orc side. The base building economy and the flow of everything feels a lot slower than modern RTS games, in my opinion. Combat is kind of a mixed bag. It's both slower and faster than later games in the series. The units are very slow, a bit unwieldy at times. There seems to be a long delay between giving an order and an action being taken, and sometimes the units almost feel like they're getting confused if you tell them to do too many things at once. The units also die way faster than later games in the series, and you don't always have time to react. A catapult shot can take out an entire army, but since once you reveal the fog of war, you can see any incoming enemies, it's mostly a game of being alert for incoming attacks by watching the minimap. The pathing is mostly terrible, but that's also true for your opponent, and I found using a line of ranged unit and catapults, and then using a knight to pull targets into range was most effective. On the last few missions, the summons you gain are so overpowered. I just made a ton of conjurers and warlocks and spammed the summons at the enemy stronghold while standing behind a line of catapults. It took a few missions to click, but once it did, I found the actual combat to be quite fun and almost puzzle-like. You're using a limited toolbox available to exploit the enemy's bad AI or pathing and lead them into traps. Alright, so I guess it's time to circle back to that initial question. Should you be playing Warcraft Orcs and Humans, the remaster specifically, in 2024? Is it worth your time? And that's after we've talked about what's been added in the remaster, what I wish they would have done in the remaster, some of the painful points, kind of the limited story, the kind of bad balance, the limited unit selection, the annoying base building, the so-so combat. You can kind of get where I'm going here. Should you be playing this game today? To be honest, it's kind of hard to recommend unless you have a ton of nostalgia for this particular game, or the series in general of Warcraft, or you want to explore the history of the RTS genre. Even if you can look beyond the archaic elements, the limited story, the simple graphics, it's far more easier and accessible to just start at Warcraft II or III. That's not to say I disliked the game or the time I spent with it. Once I gave it a fair chance, I did have a lot of fun with it, but even with the added quality of life features, the outdated elements, the annoying design choices, it makes it hard to recommend you play it today. I would honestly, if you are coming to Warcraft for the first time and you don't want to be turned out on it, start with Warcraft 3. If you've played through the other games and you really want to explore and go back and see how the series began, this is probably the best way to do that. There's some things that they got wrong, but overall, I've enjoyed my time I've spent with it. I definitely think as a package, Warcraft 1, 2, and 3, it's worth buying. But if you're new to the series and you just want to check out the best, I would start at Warcraft 2 or 3 if you want the hero units or the more classical style RTS gameplay. I'm going to end the video there. I do want to thank you for watching. I do have a full playthrough on the channel of Warcraft 1, the Orc and the Human campaign. Next, I'm going to jump into Warcraft 2 and do the same, and then a review. And then I'm going to jump into Warcraft 3 and a review. This might take me, I don't know, a month or two to get through, but I'm very excited to play all these games. I do want to thank you for watching, and have a good night, everybody. Hello, and what's up, my friends? It's ThunderBob here, and tonight we are going to be taking a look at Warcraft 2 in the Warcraft Remastered collection. I have decided to revisit this entire series with the release of the Remastered collection. So far, I played through the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and have a full playthrough and a review on the channel. And now I've finished Warcraft 2, and you can watch that playthrough. And now, what is up with that guy's eyes? That guy is really, really high. Okay, sorry, distracted. Yeah, I've got a playthrough on the channel of Warcraft 2, and tonight we're going to be talking about my thoughts on that game. And just want to spend a few minutes giving you my perspective on the game. I played this back 20-some years ago, and I am enjoying my replay of it now in 2025. As I mentioned in the review for Warcraft Orcs and Humans, my first introduction to the Warcraft franchise was watching a friend play through the PlayStation version of Warcraft 2. It was not until several years later, I would say late 99, early 2000, I got a PC of my own, and I played through the Battle.net edition of Warcraft 2. This was shortly after beating StarCraft and Brood Wars. And I do think that each game has improved the formula. And going backwards is kind of difficult because each game, each subsequent release has incrementally improved the formula and the genre has moved forward. And it can be difficult to go to those early games. Like Warcraft Orcs and Humans is very hard to recommend. I think Warcraft II had enough quality of life improvements and is much more playable than that original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, even in the Remastered collection. So I think this is a pretty good starting off point. We're going to be talking through this. So I've played Warcraft I and then II in direct succession, and it's made me realize that both of these games share a lot more DNA than I remember. While Warcraft II refined things in a lot of ways, the missions are structured in nearly identical ways. You start a mission with one or two simple objectives. There's very few surprises or story elements inside the mission. The way the races are mirrored is very, very similar between Warcraft I and Warcraft II, with just a couple of spells being different between some of the units. Also, both games have very terrible AI, and it's a major factor. Most missions, it feels like you win not necessarily through strategy, but by exploiting soft spots in the enemy programming. So let's talk about what has changed in the remaster. While the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans remastered included a ton of quality life gameplay tweaks, most of those were already present in the original release or the Battle.net 2 edition of Warcraft II, and this remaster is mostly a graphical enhancement. There are a few minor quality of life enhancements like UI improvements, you get better tooltips, you can add health bars above units, you can have a slightly larger unit selection, but beyond that, this is very much that game from 25 years ago. Now, the graphical improvements are mostly adequate. I'd say some of the units look better than others. The claim here is this is all new art, but some of these units look like an AI upscale, while others look like new hand-drawn art. It's kind of a mixed bag overall. I do prefer the new graphics to the old at this point, but I don't think it's perfect. The increased resolution is a nice addition as well, but there is no ultra-wide support. I've also run into a few technical issues with crashes or long loading times, which seems really, really odd for such kind of an archaic-looking game. I wish they would have gone a little bit harder on the gameplay improvements. You know, like shift-click commands, rally points, and the AI is probably the biggest offender. Speaking about the AI, at times the pathfinding actually feels worse here than Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Units just constantly get stuck going from one point of the map to another, unless you babysit them along the way. I also feel that a few of the missions could have used some tweaks. There are a couple of Orc missions here that are just nearly impossible, even having played it a few times and knowing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. An example of this is the Tomb of Sargeras. This is a mission that requires you to build a navy, except the enemy is already established and constantly sends larger naval armies to destroy your boats. The only solution I found was to exploit the bad AI and use catapults, pulling enemy boats into range, but far enough that the catapults could hit them. The AI was so bad that they would just sit there taking shot after shot from my catapults. Now let's talk about the story. Overall, the story in Warcraft II is better than Warcraft Orcs and Humans, but it really feels like Blizzard was still figuring out how to tell a story within the real-time strategy framework. There's a good intro video and a few short video clips between missions, and otherwise the story is told with a few sentences introducing each mission. Again, a few familiar names and locations are mentioned, but the game really does not flesh out any character or faction, or give anyone really any personality. The majority of the story in these earlier games came from reading the awesome manuals and using your imagination. It really feels like the game directly after this, StarCraft, is what led the revolution in storytelling in real-time strategy games. You had those mission introductions that had multiple speakers, you had actual named characters, you had story moments within the missions, you had really, really good intros and endings to the games, and I think this game was just a little bit too early to get all those story elements. It's not to say that the story is bad, there just really isn't enough storytelling within the game and you really can't identify with any of the characters or factions. Now let's talk about unit and balance. There are a few new units versus Warcraft Orcs and Humans. You've got upgrades for the Knight and the Ogre to the Paladin and Ogre Magi, but it's largely just giving them skills from the Cleric and Necrolite. The game added in the Demolition Squad and Goblin Sappers, which give you some new options to blow up buildings or units. Both sides also get an air unit for surveying the battlefield, namely the Gnomish Flying Machine and the Goblin Zeppelin. And there are two offensive units, air units, the Griffin Rider and the Dragon. These flying units can be kind of frustrating to control as they do damage each other and your other units, and they also seem to have a delay between action, and it's very difficult to move about a dozen of these flying units around without hurting your other flying units. And the last addition to the game is the naval units, which is an oil tanker, a transport. You've got 2 warships and a submersible, which are basically mirrored on both sides. And just like Warcraft Orcs and Humans, both sides here are nearly identical, with just a few spells differentiating the two sides. The later Blizzard RTS games introduced more unique aspects to each race, and an almost rock-paper-scissors-like combat system that helped add more strategic depth and options to the game. StarCraft II had 3 very, very unique both gameplay and visual races, and then Warcraft III added 4 completely unique races. Comparing this to those games, these races play nearly identically. I do think base building has been much improved in Warcraft II from previous games. Roads are no longer required between your buildings, which allows for a lot more player freedom with your base design. The game also introduced defensive structures, towers, that allow you to defend your base, and can also be used offensively with the removal of the road requirement. You can build town halls now that allow your base to be expanded, and many of the missions require you to take multiple bases to succeed. Really, the cost of nearly every building, unit, and upgrade feels a lot more thought out here, and it gives you a lot less downtime where you're just watching for your gold to pile up to pay that 3,000 gold for an upgrade. The gold mines are also put in more logical places near your starting point and strategically across the map. Just overall, building, organizing, like moving units within your base, it all just feels a lot smoother than Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Alright, let's discuss combat. Overall, it's a lot smoother than in Warcraft Orcs and Humans. The units are more responsive, and micromanagement during combat is no longer a chore. Attack move is way more functional here, and you can babysit your units a lot less, except when you need to move them across the map. The time to kill most units feels longer, which gives you more time to micro and move your units. You can still win most missions by using catapults out of tower range and just pulling a few enemies to your army at a time. But new strategies like massing air units, using offensive towers, also work and gives you a lot more options. The new units fit into the existing framework well without making the older units feel redundant. I do think the game relies on naval units and battles a bit too much. While I don't mind the naval battles, I find the missions requiring you to use transports a bit tedious, and I prefer just a few of them sprinkled throughout the campaign. Instead, you get these over and over again in some portions of the campaign. And let's talk about the missions and the structure of the game. Just like my thoughts on Warcraft Orcs and Humans, I found the Orc faction much more difficult than the Human faction here. Not because of the unit composition this time, but rather because of how the missions are structured. Nearly every Orc mission has you constantly harassed by an aggressive opponent, with little time to build up an army or defenses between attacks. The majority of the Human missions, I found, you were rarely on the receiving end of these attacks. You just had time to build up a force and move across the map. It feels like some of these missions could have used a balance pass, and considering this game came out less than a year after Warcraft Orcs and Humans, I guess it's understandable that it's not perfect. While the missions are more complex than in Orcs and Humans, now having multiple objectives, and some of them a little bit more complex than in that first game. There's still very little like surprise during the mission. You don't get much story element. Very rarely does something change from the outset of the mission to the end of the mission. That's not to say the missions are not fun. They're just largely simple compared to more modern real-time strategy games. So final thoughts here. In my review of Orcs and Humans, I said it was very hard to recommend this unless you have nostalgia or you want to see the history of the genre. I don't think the same is true here for Warcraft II. Most of the annoyances and archaic design choices of the original were fixed in Warcraft II, and it's a much more accessible game, and now the graphics have been improved as well. I still think Warcraft III is probably the most accessible starting point in my favorite game in the series. Most RTS players who are playing modern RTSs will probably have a better time starting at Warcraft III, but if you want to see a more classic RTS style, Warcraft II is a valid game to play, and it's still enjoyable. I totally enjoyed my playthrough of this here, and can wholeheartedly recommend this to real-time strategy fans. So we're going to end the review here. I do want to thank you for watching. Next up, I'm going to be playing through Warcraft 3. I plan to have a full playthrough on the channel, and when I'm done, I'll do a review and give you my final thoughts on the Warcraft series. I'm actually considering maybe continuing on and playing StarCraft and StarCraft 2. May not be immediately after this, but sometime this year I do want to jump into that. So we'll end it there. If you get any thoughts, any comments, please drop a comment below. And thank you for watching. Just have a good night, everybody. Hello and what is up, my friends? It is Thunder Bob here, and tonight we are going to be doing a review of Warcraft 3. If you've been following along, I am playing through the Warcraft series. Previously, I posted my reviews of Warcraft 1 and 2 and the corresponding playthroughs. Finally, we have come to my favorite game in the series, Warcraft 3. I think this game perfected the real-time strategy genre by refining the gameplay, taking lessons from the StarCraft series, which had released between Warcraft 2 and 3, and also by evolving the genre by adding in RPG elements, hero units, and a much deeper storyline than was previously found in the series. This is also by far the most accessible point to enter the series, and I highly recommend starting with Warcraft 3. The quality of life improvements and the level of polish this game received elevated it and make it a very easy game to play even 20 years later. Now, I've talked about my history with the franchise in previous videos. My first introduction to the Warcraft series was watching a friend play the PlayStation version of Warcraft II. Then a few years later, I got my own computer with the Battle.net edition of Warcraft II. I tried to play through Warcraft 1 after that, but found it very archaic just a few years later, and only recently played through that with the remastered version. I purchased both Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne expansion on their respective release days, and I can remember playing through them in a matter of days. And then I spent the next couple of years addicted to the multiplayer component on Battle.net. I have a lot of nostalgia for this time in my gaming history. This was probably Blizzard's high point. In my mind, Warcraft 3 was the end of the classic Blizzard that I had grown to love. Before the release of World of Warcraft, Blizzard managed to release a top-tier game or expansion essentially every year from 1994 to 2003. And without looking at reviews, you just knew it was going to be a banger. With the release of World of Warcraft, the studio essentially became the WoW studio for the next decade. And though I did enjoy that game and I played it for a few years, and to varying degrees I liked the other releases like Diablo 3, StarCraft 2, and Diablo 4, the studio has never quite recovered the level of quality, originality, and the release cadence that they had during those golden years. Okay, well that's enough bagging on Blizzard and how they're a vacant husk of that original studio. Let's talk about Warcraft 3. This review I'm going to break up into essentially two components. The first part, I'm going to talk about Reforged, what works, what doesn't. And then the second half is actually just going to be a look at Warcraft 3 in general. So let's start talking about Reforged. To start with, at release back in 2020, Reforged was a complete mess. Promised features such as the improved cinematics and revamped campaign were essentially scrapped or curtailed due to Blizzard reducing the budget during development. Beyond that, the online gameplay was gutted with a ton of features missing. Also, the improved graphics were quite divisive, with many criticizing them as worse than the original. A 2.0 version of Reforged was released along with the remasters of Warcraft I and II in November. In the intervening 4 years, many issues have been addressed. All of the multiplayer functionality has been returned, and the game has received its first balance patch in decades. A revamp of the campaign was released briefly and then removed due to bugs and has never been returned. You can actually play through this version through a third-party campaign. That's not to say there are no campaign changes. Just about every map saw some changes in the official release, with about 5 of the maps being recreated almost entirely, but it's a far cry from what was originally advertised at the announcement of the Reforged version. With the 2.0 release, they also did some further updates to the graphics. They added a ton of toggles where you can select if you want the original graphics or the Reforged graphics, or upgraded versions of the original graphics. It also lets you pick more granularly what versions you want to utilize for things like units, heroes, and portraits. I played through the campaign with the Reforged graphics, as I understand the graphics you pick actually determine if you get the revised campaign, and selecting the older graphics you end up losing out on many of the game's improvements. Also, ultrawide support has been added, which I'm very grateful for. When I first booted up the Reforged graphics, I was pretty horrified. The updated art just doesn't really mesh with the rest of the game. Many of the units are going for a much more realistic style versus the cartoony look of the original release. It's very jarring because the background art and buildings don't really match this updated unit and hero style. After playing a few levels, it was less noticeable, and I actually like the look of some of the heroes and units, but overall I feel like this should have been done in-house rather than farming it out to a third-party art studio. And the artwork deserved more attention. Overall, I'm glad they've released the Reforged edition and have made improvements since release, but overall this is a really disappointing re-release when you compare it to the StarCraft Remaster or the Diablo Resurrected, which was handled with much more care. I think the biggest issue is definitely the bait and switch here. They promised a lot, and then when it came out in 2020, it was missing so many of those features, and even features that were in the original Warcraft released 20 years ago were missing. They fixed some of those elements, but they still haven't actually brought this up to what was originally promised, and I don't think they ever will. So it's very disappointing. This is probably the best we're ever going to get. We might get a few small minor patches, but my guess is that we're not going to get a big revamp like everyone really wanted when they announced this thing. The Reforged version is probably still the easiest and most accessible way to play, and if you did not play the original game 20 years ago, the change in art style is probably not going to be as noticeable to you. So if you're looking to play this today, I would probably recommend starting here versus trying to track down those original discs or to try to find an old binary of the original game. Okay, so I'm done harping on the Reforged edition. The next section of this review is just going to be about Warcraft III in general. Just why it is such a good game and why it holds up even today. We're going to start off with the story. The story here is on an entirely different level of quality versus the previous Warcraft games. There are many more named characters, and these characters actually have personality and motivation to them. Giving you reasons to care for the individual characters makes you feel much more invested in the larger narrative. The story does fall victim to a few tropes of the fantasy genre, but considering it's nearly 20 years old, it still holds up really well. There's a ton of classic Blizzard cinematics here, starting and finishing most campaigns with them. Before, during, and after most missions are in-game cinematics with full voice acting, which fills out the narrative and explains your current mission. The story covers a ton of ground. The prologue starts off with Thrall being visited by Medivh, and it's mostly a tutorial campaign. It leads into the human campaign where you play as Arthas, as he slowly gets corrupted until he finally becomes a Death Knight. The Undead then picks up right after that, with you basically going back as Arthas and conquering the human lands that you were protecting in the first campaign. That leads into the Orc campaign, where Thrall is trying to found his own empire, his own country away from the humans as they try to shrug off those barbarian-like roots. And then finally you have the Night Elf campaign, where all these stories converge as all these groups try to defend against the demonic invasion. And this leads into the Frozen Throne, the expansion campaign. You start out as the Night Elves, and you are playing as Maeve, the Warden of Illidan, and you're trying to track him down, leading into the Human campaign, which is actually in this campaign a Blood Elf campaign, where you are the last remaining High Elves who have now rebranded as the Blood Elves, and you are trying to make your way along the, after the destruction of Quel'Thalas. Eventually, you meet up with Illidan and join forces with him, which leads to the last campaign, the Scourge campaign, where you play as the Undead. You pick back up Arthas' storyline, and you lead him to the Frozen Throne, the titular Frozen Throne, that Illidan is also trying to reach and destroy. And each of these campaigns lead one into the next in just a really unique way. Like, if you think back to Warcraft I and II, that storyline was just so simplistic and basic. Now in Warcraft III, you have this weaving narrative where each campaign flows seamlessly into the next one. It's just beautiful. I love the story, I love the cinematics, the characters. Modern Warcraft, and by that I mean World of Warcraft, I think, which is today way more popular than Warcraft ever was. It really, is built on the back of Warcraft 3. All of the major heroes and story elements largely came from Warcraft 3. If you ask a modern Warcraft fan, like, to tell you the story of the earlier games, they probably couldn't, but they know most of the heroes from Warcraft 3, they know most of the major story beats, and this really set the stage for World of Warcraft and the future of the series. And the final bonus campaign, the Founding of Durotar, the Orc campaign in the Frozen Throne, is essentially like a proto World of Warcraft mission with RPG elements and character progression. It feels like it was really a testing ground for things that they built into into World of Warcraft several years later. Next, let's talk about mission variety and difficulty. The missions have a ton of variety, from traditional maps where you have to clear all the enemies or defend a base for a set amount of time, but many have very unique mechanics or features. There are maps that are basically like proto Defense Against the Ancients or tower defense maps. Sometimes they can feel a bit gimmicky, but they're a lot of fun. There are perhaps a few too many missions where you're leading a hero and just a couple of units across a map, and not enough missions where you're actually building up a full base and you get the full complement of your race's units. And that may be my one complaint. The game holds your hand a bit too much. The first few tutorial missions are very slow, and each of the first few missions for each race are also quite slow, and it doles out the units very, very slowly over several missions. It's not till like the last 1, 2, 3 missions, especially in the base game, when you have the full selection of units available to you. I would happily cut a few of these early missions for a few more late game maps where you have all units available and you have more traditional clear the map objectives. It definitely feels like the Frozen Throne went a little crazy with these missions and the difficulty. The base game, you usually only have 1, maybe 2 heroes at a time. In the Frozen Throne, there are missions where you have 3 or 4 heroes. There are missions where you control 1, 2, 3 separate armies, sometimes separate races at the same time, each having to harvest their own resources, each having to build their own army with unique population caps. It could be pretty overwhelming, but it adds to the fun. I played through the original campaign, the non-expansion campaign, on hard mode without too much trouble. It was satisfying and just short of frustrating on that hardest mission. I started the Frozen Throne on hard and made some headway, and then I kind of found it a little bit frustrating. It's not overly difficult, but it feels tedious and, kind of battles of attrition, and ended up restarting and playing through most of it on the normal difficulty. I think some of the changes that they've made to the multiplayer may have bled into the campaign and negatively affected it. Also, I've read anecdotally that some of the changes in the Reforged version actually made the campaign harder than what was intended. I don't know 100% on that, but anecdotally I've read a lot of people say that. So overall, I really like the mission structure. I like the overall, campaign. Maybe it's a little too hand-holdy, especially the first couple of tutorial missions. There's so much text on your screen, so many hints just constantly popping up that it could almost overwhelm you, and there's no way to turn those off. Even if you're an expert and you know everything about the game, you can't turn those hints off. So next I want to talk about the gameplay, and this is probably the reason I think this is one of the best RTSs of all time, one of my favorite games of all time, is, Warcraft 3 has 4 playable races, and unlike the previous Warcraft games, each race is very unique. There are a few units that overlap between the races, but each of the 4 races here play very, very differently. The units themselves are very different. If you compare a footman to an orc, they are both the basic starting melee unit, but they have very different costs and power levels, and they fill very different niches in each of the races. Then you have units that are very unique to each race, like the bouncing glaives on the Night Elf Huntress, or the undead necromancer summoning skeletons. That's not even touching on hero units that all feel pretty unique and give you a ton of versatility. Each hero has 4 skills to level up throughout the campaign or during a multiplayer match. You can also collect items that improve your hero, and potions and scrolls. The system is really the starting point for the entire Dota genre. Even base building and the tech trees are very unique for each race and have a ton of unique mechanics, like the farm equivalent. For humans, it's just a farm. For orc, they can be occupied by peons as a defensive structure. For the undead, they can be upgraded into tower equivalents for base defense. And for the night elves, they're healing wells. How each race uses its workers and harvests resources is also subtly different. The tech tree is a bit simplified from previous games in the genre, but it really lets you focus on what's important and get right into the action. The difference between each race is apparent in the campaign, but in multiplayer it really shines, having 4 unique races with 4 different heroes and more neutral heroes available. It makes each match feel very unique. And I'm by no means an expert, I don't really follow the meta, but jumping in a game, I feel like I have so many possible gameplay options. The moment-to-moment combat also feels just about perfect in this game. The time to kill has been increased, giving you more time to utilize spells and hero abilities and micro units more effectively. There are different types of damage and armor, and selecting the correct type of unit to overcome your enemy is a ton of fun here. Every unit feels important and upgrades are very meaningful. The hero units were such a smart idea to add to the genre, and utilizing them in combination with your army just feels so right. And speaking of multiplayer, Warcraft 3 at release had one of the best online implementations of any RTS game. With the 2.0 release, most of those elements have been re-implemented. You've got ranked matches, guilds, tournaments, custom games. There is a sizable community, and it's easy to find a game these days. There are a ton of custom games, from unique campaigns to RPG maps, and a ton of Dota-style games. I can highly recommend Warcraft 3 if you're looking for a fun game to play with friends, or if you want to be competitive and reach the top rank. So, final thoughts. I love Warcraft 3, and I am so happy to have replayed through this series, but coming back to this game in particular has been such a joy. From the single-player campaign to the excellent multiplayer, the 4 unique races, the incredible story and cinematics, this is in my mind the pinnacle of the Warcraft franchise, and my hope is someday that Blizzard is allowed to return to its roots and develop another real-time strategy Warcraft game. The problem is many of those key people are gone, and Blizzard really is a different developer from the team that made this game 20 years ago. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but if the effort put into Warcraft 3 Reforged is any indication, I'm not really going to hold my breath here. So, I'm going to end the video there. I can highly recommend Warcraft 3, and, as kind of middling as the Reforged version is, it's still probably the best way to play this classic game. And you have options if you want to play with the new Reforged graphics or the original graphics. So really, it's a good entry point if you are interested in the Warcraft series. I would probably recommend starting with Warcraft 3 unless you really have a lot of nostalgia for the 2D era that came before that. So again, I'm going to sign off here. I want to thank you for watching, everybody. I think in the future, I'm going to continue playing some real-time strategy games. I actually want to play through StarCraft Remastered and StarCraft II again. It's been a few years on both of those, and maybe in the future I'll do another playthrough and review. But that's probably some time off. I've just put 70 hours or so into real-time strategy games. So again, thank you for watching, and have a good night.